In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night. Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. And today I am talking about the movie Mr. Sardonicus, which I have been wanting to talk about for a long time. This is a review that was initially requested of me by the amazing Evil Stevel back in spring, summer-ish time of last year. This review has been in the works since then, pretty much. I had some box sets I wanted to cover and some other things I wanted to do. When I finally got around to doing this one, I was going to do this one shortly after I did the Castle Freak movies. This lovely indicator release of the movie was going to be coming out, so I was like, you know what? I really want this. I'll get more into why I really wanted this a little bit later. So I waited for this. Didn't come until earlier this month. But I'm finally reviewing it today, and I'm really happy to be reviewing it. And of course, thank you to Evil Stevel for suggesting that I review this, because I love this movie. I will have links to his channel either in the cards or below, or both. Mr. Sardonicus is a movie that came out in 1961. It was directed by the legendary William Castle, who directed the original versions of House on Haunted Hill and 13 Ghosts, which were actually remade by Dark Castle Productions, who I think were started to remake his movies, as well as some unsung movies, in my opinion, like The Night Walker. This film stars Ronald Lewis, who is in the 1960 movie Jigsaw, nothing to do with the Saw franchise, The Full Treatment and Taste of Fear, Audrey Dalton, who is in The Monster That Challenged the World, the 1953 version of Titanic and Kitten with a Whip, Oscar Homolka, who was in Alfred Hitchcock's Sabotage, The Invisible Woman, and a 1968 version of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Jack Palance. And finally, this film also stars Erica Peters, who is in House of the Damned, Monstrosity, and Heroes Die Young. And usually I only list 4 cast members, but it would be wrong of me to not mention Guy Rolfe, who plays Mr. Sardonicus. And he was in a great number of the Puppet Master movies. I don't think he was in the first one, which is the only one I've seen, but he's been in a ton of the others. He was also in Stuart Gordon's Dolls and Now the Screaming Starts. This film is actually based on a story that was published in Playboy, which I believe William Castle read and decided he really liked. And the story of this film is that a young doctor by the name of Sir Robert Cargrave, who has become very acclaimed in London, receives a letter telling him to go to the remote area of Gorslava, which I presume is in Eastern Europe, to visit his childhood sweetheart, Maud, who has married an enigmatic baron known only as Sardonicus. And when he gets there, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. He finds a woman in one of the rooms who's been covered in leeches, who he quickly rescues. He reunites with Maud, catches up with her, and is introduced to the Baron, who wears a very creepy, kind of uncanny valley face-like mask, and has a disconcerting personality as well. The Doctor soon learns why Sardonicus wears the mask, and why both Maud and Sardonicus have sent for him. So Sir Robert has to figure out why this was so urgent and solve the problem. So the score for this film was done by Von Dexter, who, as far as I can tell, may have done just a few other films, but He is best known for doing 3 other William Castle movies, being House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, and 13 Ghosts. Von Dexter's score for the film is very traditionally spooky in the vein of those other scores. It's nothing really stand out. There's not a distinctive theme that I really picked up on and got stuck in my head or anything like that, but it serves the tone of the film really well. I'm not sure what instrument creates that sound that you hear when someone's fading into a flashback or a dream sequence. You probably know the sound that I'm thinking about. The score makes very prominent use of that sound, and it's very mysterious and spooky sounding in a way that I really liked. On a possibly negative note, the score is also super overwrought in a few places where I'm not sure it needs to be, but at the same time I kind of love it. There's a scene where Sir Robert Cargrave arrives in the train station at Gorslava, and he's talking to someone there, and he's like, "Oh, I'm just waiting here for a carriage," and this guy, I think he might be the station master, is like, "Oh, I haven't heard of any carriage coming around here." And Cargrave is like, "Oh yeah, I'm waiting for the carriage of Baron Sardonicus." And the station master's eyes get really wide, and there's this really loud sting of music. If this film was made now, I don't think it would have been that aggressive with the music right there. They probably would have wanted it to be a little bit more subtle, but at the same time, that kind of melodramatic, over-the-top tone kind of suits what this film is anyway, and I'm not sure that scene would have worked quite as well without that really intense sting of music, to be honest. Before I get into the story of this film also features a little, I guess, wraparound intro-outro-ish thing from William Castle himself, who actually kind of just walks into London in 1880. They actually set the time and place of the film before William Castle walks in, and he just happens to be in London, which is kind of weird, but I also kind of love that. I love that he opens the film saying, "It's good to see you again, my homicidal friends," which is actually something I tried to use at the very beginning of my channel as an intro, and I was just like, you know what, I'm not going to rip off William Castle. I'll leave that to him. It might also be a reference to homicidal, which I think came out before this, but I'm not sure. And his whole intro for the film is just him delighting in how horrific this story is about to be. It's kind of like the way Alfred Hitchcock introduces some of the stuff he's done, but William Castle feels less prim and proper and more like this kind of earthy showman who has this huge grin on his face and is just reveling in the nasty, dark, gothic, melodramatic piece of insanity that's about to unfold, and I love that. On the other hand, the intro does also have this really weird bit of overdubbing in it at the very end, where he says, "And I hope your nightmares are nice ones," and it's clearly not lined up with his mouth. It may have been just an afterthought to put that line in by either Castle himself or the studio, but they really shouldn't have done it because it just doesn't line up with his mouth at all, and it's just kind of annoying. The thing that this film is most notable for, besides its crazy plot, it is notable for its gimmick, and William Castle is known for having gimmicks to go with his films. He's been doing this since House on Haunted Hill, where he had Emergo, where during a certain scene he would fly a skeleton over the crowd on a rope to simulate this skeleton emerging from the screen. With the Tingler, he had Percepto, where he would rig these buzzers underneath the seats to create the sense that you're feeling the fear coming off of the screen. And actually, he was doing gimmicks like that since, I think, his very first film, Macabre. This is my personal favorite of his gimmicks, and that is the punishment pole. The punishment pole is presumably where the audience, right before the final scene of the film, gets to decide the fate of Mr. Sardonicus. Everyone in the audience would have been given a punishment pole ballot that looks like this if they think Mr. Sardonicus should be shown mercy, they would hold it up, thumbs up like this, and if they think Mr. Sardonicus should be shown no mercy, they would hold it thumbs down like this. If you're wondering why I have printed out punishment poll cards, I actually showed this movie in my high school's horror movie club. I really wanted to show this movie, so I did, and I thought it would be really fun to actually get the chance to do a William Castle gimmick, so printed out punishment poll cards for everybody there, and we did the thing at the end of the movie, and it was great. But the thing is, William Castle only ever actually filmed one ending for the movie, and the punishment poll was his way of, one, doing the gimmicks that he always loved doing with most of his movies, and two, the studio didn't like the original ending he filmed for the movie, and he was just like, you know what, we'll have it both ways. I'm going to film two endings, and we'll let the audience decide which one they like better. Except he never actually filmed the second ending. He just kept his original ending, which is a total dick move, but I kind of love it, especially because at the very end of the movie, right before the final scene, William Castle walks back in, and he's got this little notepad, and we get to see him kind of pretending to talk to the audience and look at all of their ballots, and he's like, little boy in the back, please sit down. I can't read the ballots behind you. Couple over there, is that one votes or two? And he kind of pretends to add everything up, and then at the end, he's just like, you know what? No mercy. Absolutely just William Castle trolling the audience, but it's delightful. Getting into the actual story of this film, the movie opens with Sir Robert Cargrave treating this young girl who can't walk and kind of applying this little treatment to her legs. She's crying, she's in huge pain. He's successful, but it really sets up a lot of what makes this movie so creepy even now, which is kind of implied body horror, if you will. There's a lot of uncomfortable medical stuff going on. There's a lot of stuff regarding Mr. Sardonicus, who wears the mask because he has a deformity. I'm not going to spoil what that is for you. We never actually see anything incredibly graphic body horror-wise in this movie, but there's a lot of discussion of medical procedures and physical afflictions that gets into your head and is really disturbing on its own. And then when we do get a few scenes where a few things are actually shown, it becomes that much more creepy. A few things that link into that are these scenes of characters being tortured in Baron Sardonicus's residence. His servant Anna, as I mentioned before, is found with leeches on her face, which is one of the most graphic instances of horror in the film. Shortly after that, Sir Robert Cargrave talks to Crowell, the servant, is like, what the hell is this? And Crowell is like, well, you know, do you not in your own medical practice have what you call guinea pigs? And he gives this little smile, and he's just totally unfazed by how horrific what he's doing is, as is Mr. Sardonicus. For some reason, as messed up as the situation is, with the kind of over-the-top tone of the film, it becomes darkly humorous. There are just little things about the film that are just slightly off or weird or just unusually intense in a way that is very funny, even though it maybe shouldn't be. And the way the story gradually reveals itself, we get kind of these little clues as to what's going on, just these little odd occurrences that gradually build up to something greater. It is very much in this kind of wonderfully gothic tradition of almost kind of horrific mysteries that we see in things like Dracula with Jonathan Harker exploring the castle and trying to figure out what's going on, right up to the modern day with a movie like Crimson Peak. We also, at one point, get a quick little flashback sequence where Baron Sardonicus talks about his origins, which I really don't want to spoil for you, but it's this whole tiny little kind of gothic fairy tale in its own right. It has the tone and kind of the setup of almost a Grimm's fairy tale type story, but it ends on this note that feels like this really creepy sting from some kind of horror anthology. The Baron Sardonicus flashback could be a horror short in its own right, but it's works great as a part of this larger movie, and it sets up some stuff that I'll talk about more with Sardonicus's character in a minute, particularly a lot of the guilt and self-loathing that he feels because of what occurred in his past. Pacing-wise, this movie is really solid. I had forgotten just how fast this movie moves. William Castle is kind of known for having this kind of economy to the way he tells stories. Everything moves at a really quick pace. It's just all the essentials with all of the fat pretty much trimmed, and that also goes for the way he does sets and everything else. Everything you need is there. He's not cutting corners for the sake of cutting corners, but nothing that's unnecessary is there. I love a slow burn. I love something that's self-indulgent in some ways, and just in terms of how messed up this movie can be, it is a little bit self-indulgent, but just in terms of the way the story is told and the way everything's shot, it's all fat trimmed, just the essentials, and I like that about this movie. And I kind of mentioned the gradual reveal of everything being in this great Gothic tradition similar to what we get in Dracula. There are a lot of things that as I was watching this, I realized they remind me a lot of Dracula. We've got this isolated, I think it's a castle, it could also be a manor, which of course is very cut off from the rest of the world in a lot of ways. It's this remote area in Eastern Europe, but at the same time, Maud and Sardonicus are getting all of these journals from London and all the latest fashions from other parts of Europe, and they're very up to date on the culture of the time. And we've also got these doors that are forbidden for anyone except the Baron to enter, and there are no mirrors in the castle for reasons. All of that reminds me of Dracula for the same reason, just because of the gradual mystery that Jonathan has to figure out while he's at the castle. But then you've got kind of this juxtaposition of the culture of the time, what would have been contemporary in 1880, and this very old world Gothic feel. Because Dracula, in the book, while he lives in this remote, crumbling castle, he speaks perfect English, which is something that usually doesn't get translated to film, and he reads all these journals and current fiction, and he's very, very well read in the ways of England. The other similarity that I think this has to particularly the original novel of Dracula is the way it juxtaposes the Gothic with contemporary technology and medical knowledge. You've got in the book kind of this old world, larger than life vampiric force, and they're fighting it with blood transfusions and using the technology of the Victorian era. Even though this film came out in 1961, it is trying to be fairly contemporary to 1880 and yet still have these references to ghouls, which is a very prominent thing in the movie, and this kind of old world Gothic feel. As much as I love vampires, those kind of little explorations of both old world folklore and kind of contemporary Victorian culture are pretty much just as fascinating to me as the vampirism itself. And even though there's no vampirism in Mr. Sardonicus, I realized as I was watching it that it kind of scratches that same itch for me, and that might be why it's my favorite William Castle movie. And of course, the ending, as I mentioned, they only filmed one. Part of me would have wondered what the merciful ending would have been, but honestly, the ending that we get is super twisted and the most fitting end for the film you could have. I would not change it for the world. Visually speaking, when we're in London, this movie has kind of a decent period piece feel, kind of filtered through what we see in a lot of Hollywood movies of the 30s going onward. But once we're in Gorslava, everything becomes a lot more heightened and gothic. Everything's coated in fog, and we have this, again, I don't recall if it's castle or manor, but it's very, very ornate and elegant and beautiful, but it's also has these kind of crumbling, unsavory areas, and the garden only grows plants like hemlock and deadly nightshade. nothing traditionally pretty grows there, and it has this dark, melodramatic unfriendliness to it that is beautiful in its own way. The castle itself evokes a lot of things that I thought were interesting about Sardonicus's character. It gets across the ego he has managed to develop. He's a very haughty character. There are these giant S's emblazoned on everything everywhere. He has disowned his forefathers by just leaving empty picture frames without the pictures of his forefathers in them on the wall. But at the same time, he's put wallpaper up over all of the mirrors, and he just can't stand to look at himself. And there are these things that are a little bit kind of masochistic and self-loathing that have kind of worked their way into the architecture of the building itself, which is a very gothic thing to do, and I love it. The mask that Sardonicus wears is very creepy, kind of for the same reason that Michael Myers' mask in Halloween is creepy. It looks like he's wearing a face. It's the most simple mask ever, but there's something uncanny valley about it that has just the right amount of creepiness. Camera work wise, I said this movie isn't self-indulgent, and it isn't for the most part, but there are just a few interesting little transitions. We have this little dream sequence where Sir Robert is seeing these faces of different people who he's met throughout the film, and they're kind of distorted in weird ways, superimposed over his sleeping figure, and they're repeating lines from earlier that have bothered him. And then there's also another scene later on where he's in the carriage and he's thinking about the letter that Maud sent him, and for some reason the screen goes black and it just focuses in with this little circle around the carriage wheel for some reason. It's a interesting visual, but I have no idea what they were trying to say with it. It's a little bit weird. Character-wise, Sir Robert Cargrave is honestly kind of bland. He's your traditional leading man kind of character, but I like him all in all. He's very well acted by Ronald Lewis, and he has this kind of craftiness to him and this medical knowledge that he'll bring to the table in certain situations that kept me invested in his character, even if he doesn't have a lot going on emotionally or psychologically or whatever. I absolutely love the character of Crowl, Sardonicus' manservant. He's very creepy in some ways. He has these kind of twisted, sociopathic, sadistic scenes, again, just because of the kind of odd tone of the film and kind of some of his odd delivery and inflection. I find him a bit goofy, which just added to my love of the character. And he's also very, very tragic in some ways. He only has one eye, and it really isn't brought up at all until towards the end of the film, and throughout the film we kind of see him putting his hand over his eye and kind of particularly bothered about that, and more bothered about that as the film progresses. It really makes you wonder what happened to this guy, and there is some pathos to his character that we get that I thought added another dimension to him. All of those elements of the character kind of gave me Peter Lorre type energy. It's a character that I could absolutely see being played by an actor like Peter Lorre, but the way that Oscar Homolka does it, I wouldn't change for the world. It's a really unique performance. I love the two sides that we get to Sardonicus. He's got, again, this kind of masochism and self-loathing to him because of his past, and that makes him almost sympathetic, but what he has been through, and possibly because he has become a baron, he has become very, very elegant, very cruel and sadistic, and very sexist. The way he talks to Maud, who's his wife, is horrible. There's this scene where he has a little private party and brings girls in from the village and picks the one he likes the best to have a night with and pays the rest off, and he compares them all to different flavors of wine, and it's really gross. There's a part of me that wants to sympathize with Sardonicus, but he's just such a misogynistic piece of shit that I can't. And I love that the film addresses the sympathetic aspects of his character without backing away from just the monster that he has become. There's this awkward thing that might be a love triangle and might not, and kind of dips in and out of that between Maud and Robert and Sardonicus, it just adds to the uncanny, uncomfortable feeling that this whole movie has while still kind of having a cozy gothic feel. As far as female characters go in this film, though, that's probably its biggest flaw. You have Maud, you have Anna, the servant at the Baron's residence. You have Alenka, who's Sardonicus' wife in the flashback, and Sardonicus' guests of honor at his little private party, and all of them just kind of feel like plot devices to move the story forward for the male characters, which I wasn't about. Alenka probably has the most intense personality, but she, in keeping with the kind of Grimm's fairy tale tone, feels kind of like the wicked stepmother or stepsisters from Cinderella in kind of her haughty, money-loving manner. And we do get a little bit of backstory on Maud, which talks about why she actually ended up marrying the Baron and how she feels about that, which I liked. But it really does kind of get swept aside and doesn't really come into play the way a lot of elements of the male characters' stories did. So they were really the focus of the film anyway, but the kind of lack of development and way the female characters just kind of feel like a plot device was the weakest part of this film, in my opinion. And effects-wise, this movie does have a few little bits of body horror. There's Crowell's missing eye, which the skin has kind of started to heal over, which is gross. And we do eventually see what Sardonicus' deformity is. And both of those are clearly makeup effects, but it's kind of the thought that counts, and you think about what that would actually feel like, and it's still very wonderfully creepy. All in all, if you weren't aware at this point, I absolutely love this movie. There are a few things that could be improved, but it is right in my wheelhouse in terms of being a classic melodramatic gothic horror story that also has some elements of physical horror and some medical elements that are genuinely creepy to me. If you like William Castle's other movies, and if you like gothic horror or a movie like, say, Crimson Peak, I think you will absolutely love this. I think if you like some of the more twisted kind of exploitation type horror films that were to come in the 1970s, I also think you will really enjoy this movie. And not a lot is shown, but a lot of really twisted stuff is implied. And I would highly recommend picking up the Indicator release of this movie. It just came out this year. It is loaded with special features. I'm particularly excited because there's an audio commentary with Sam Dagan and Kat Ellinger, who run the Daughters of Darkness podcast for Diabolique magazine. They also did a really great commentary for The Blood-Spattered Bride that I loved, so I think they're going to do a great job with this one. And there is a commentary on the trailer for the movie by the legendary Stuart Gordon, which should be fun. That is my review of Mr. Sardonicus. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!